Mr. Vijay Gokhale and dear participants, namaste and good afternoon. Welcome to our very special webinar on the rise of China. Before I start, let me briefly introduce NICE. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is a research think tank registered under the Companies Act 2006 of Nepal, working towards bringing in research excellence in the field of international relations, international economy, security, and development, and looking for better approaches for enhanced international cooperation and relations for a better, peaceful, and stable world. China studies is our major research topic at NICE. China studies as a whole brings into a perspective of the rising powers mounting economic, military, and diplomatic cloud that certainly has the aptitude to either overturn or sustain the current contemporary world order. The center broadly examines China's international strategic thinking and conduct, foreign and security policy, and the impact of domestic politics and economy on China's foreign relations. It further addresses China's emergence in the face of the world in flux, domestic politics, economy, society, culture, People's Liberation Army, and Tibet Autonomous Region, and most importantly, her engagement with each of South Asian countries. As you all know, to talk on today's special topic, we have Mr. Vijay Gokhale. Mr. Vijay Gokhale is a non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie India. He retired from the Indian Foreign Service in January 2020 after a diplomatic career that spanned 39 years. From January 2018 to January 2020, he served as the Foreign Secretary of India. Prior to his term as a Foreign Secretary, he had served as India's High Commissioner to Malaysia from January 2010 to October 2013, and the Ambassador of India to the Federal Republic of Germany from October 2013 to January 2016, and as the Ambassador of India to the People's Republic of China from January 2016 to October 2017. He served as head of the India-Taipei Association in Taiwan from July 2003 to January 2007. During his time in the headquarters at Ministry of External Affairs, he has also worked in key positions in the East Asia Division, including as the Joint Secretary, Director General for East Asia from March 2007 to December 2009. He has worked extensively on matters relating to the Indo-Pacific region, with a special emphasis on China's politics and diplomacy. Since his retirement from the Foreign Service, he has contributed opinion piece to the New York Times, Foreign Policy, Times of India, The Hindu, The Indian Express, and several others. His third book on China between 1990 and 2010 is published this year. And he lives in Pune, as he said. He's a distinguished faculty at the Symbiosis International University in Pune since January 2021. He speaks English, Hindi, Marathi, and Chinese or Mandarin. He did his master's degree in history from University of Delhi in 1980, much before many of us were born. He studied Mandarin Chinese at the Chinese University of Hong Kong in 1983-1984. Mr. Gokhale, once again, welcome to our program. Kindly make remarks in around 20-25 minutes, which will be followed by question and answers. The program is streaming live on Facebook and several other platforms. We would like to request all our participants to drop their question on Zoom chat or on the Facebook Live. You can also tweet or you can WhatsApp your questions. We would like to request all our audience also to like our Facebook page, subscribe NICE Nepal YouTube channel, and also share the live video so that maximum can benefit from this discussion. Mr. Vijay Gokhale, over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Pramodji. And I want to also thank the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement for inviting me to speak about my book today. As you mentioned in the introduction, I have worked for the better part of my career in the Indian Foreign Service on China and East Asia. And over the last 39 or 40 years, I saw the necessity for people from my country, from India, as well as from the region as a whole, to develop their own perspectives on China. While there are many people who have written on bilateral relations between India and China, between Nepal and China, between Pakistan and China, and so on, there are relatively few perspectives on China itself by people from India or from South Asia in general. And this has led to a dependency on Western narratives. But the Western perspective on China is neither good for public understanding for South Asians, nor is it good for policymakers. Because our circumstances are very different from those of the West. Geopolitically, we are much closer to China than the West is. Economically, we are developing countries, whereas the relationship between West and China for most of the time was a relationship between a developed and a developing country. And there are also socio-cultural differences that we as Asians share, which are not shared by the West. And therefore, as I said, developing an Indian perspective is something I deem to be of great importance, given the fact that China is not only a significant and close neighbor, geographically speaking, but it is also a formidable economy, a formidable military, a major diplomatic power, and so on. And therefore, after my retirement, the books that I have written are a small contribution to that process of trying to develop an Indian perspective. There are many good young Indian researchers who are working on China, and I am hoping that this will inspire them to contribute on China in much more meaningful ways for the rest of their working lives. My first book, Pramodji, was called Tiananmen Square, The Making of a Protest. It covered a very seminal event in contemporary Chinese politics, that is the student demonstrations of 1989. And this event has actually shaped China's post-Cold War politics, its economy, and its foreign policy. And the impact of those developments that happened in Beijing in the summer of 1989 continues to resonate to this day. But that book, although it dealt with this incident, it actually covered China's development from the end of the Cultural Revolution, that is roughly from 1978 until 1989. And the perspective I brought to that book was essentially somewhat different from that of the West. Firstly, I never felt it was a democratic movement or a movement for democracy in the way that India, Nepal, and other countries have experienced such movements in the past. To my mind, the underlying causes were economic. There was high inflation, joblessness, the economy was overheating, people were unhappy with the way in which the economy was being handled. And there were factions within the Communist Party that took control of the uprisings of students, the anger of the students. And we saw the incident unfold in Beijing, leading to the military crackdown on the 4th of June. The outcome of the Tiananmen incident was to reinforce the centrality of the Chinese Communist Party in Chinese politics. My second book, the recent one, which has been published by HarperCollins in September 2022, is titled After Tiananmen, The Rise of China. And the book is written in a very easy style of reading. The stories that I tell in that book are essentially of the successes and failures of China in the post-Cold War period. So there are separate chapters on the Chinese economy, on politics, on the party itself, on its foreign and national security policy, and also a chapter on India-China relations. And really, I have tried to use language which is relatively simple, because I want to write for the common reader, not for the academic or for the expert. What is the key central message that I am trying to convey through this book? The key message I am trying to convey is that the real rise of China took place in this 20 years between the end of Deng Xiaoping's period as the leader of China and the beginning of Xi Jinping's period as the leader of China. Because there is a mistaken impression among many Indians that it is Xi Jinping who has led the rise of China. My contention in the book is that China really rose before the 20 years before Xi Jinping assumed power. and that by 2013, when Xi Jinping became president of the People's Republic of China, China had already risen. Now, there are two key pillars which underpin all the stories in my book. The first major point I make is that this rise took place because China's leaders took real political risk in doing reforms. And the second key pillar that I predicate all my writings on is that there was a relative relaxation of authoritarian controls over society in general, over economy and so on, which allowed for an explosion of entrepreneurship, of innovation, of art, of culture and of science, which really led to this remarkable growth that we have witnessed. And I want to elaborate briefly on both these points. What do I mean by political risk? What I mean to say is that the Chinese leaders undertook reforms which questioned the entire basis and system of communism as had existed in China until that time, of which the two main pillars were public ownership of all means of production and a welfare system from the cradle to the grave. Now, I want to disabuse those who believe that there is no political risk involved when an authoritarian system does this. Because my own sense is that the political risk is much greater for an authoritarian system than it is for a democracy. In a democracy, when leaders take political risks and the risk does not result in tangible gain, then you lose at the next general election. But in a dictatorship, in an authoritarian system, when you take the risk and the risk fails, we have seen in the past in Chinese communist history that you not only lose power, you also lose personal freedom. And in some cases during the Cultural Revolution, Chinese leaders also lost their lives. This is what I mean by saying that the Chinese leadership took real political risk. And they did this by entering uncharted waters and with untested human resources. There was no precedent, no experienced people who could move away from complete public ownership to a sort of mix of private and public ownership, or who could reform the welfare system so that the burden of the state was reduced. Similarly, there were no earlier examples of decentralization or of competition being introduced between provinces and between counties. And the risk was very great for Chinese leaders because factionalism within the party, challenges to the central authority, all this required very careful political and ideological preparation. And the Chinese leadership had no means of knowing whether it would impact on social stability when they decided to sort of break or smash the iron rice bowl concept. The iron rice bowl was essentially a concept that from the time you were born in China to the time you died, the state would look after all your needs. And this had become very expensive for the Chinese government and state, and therefore had to be reformed. So throughout the book, many of the incidents and issues that I talk about, the underlying message is that real political risk was taken by this party and its leaders following Deng Xiaoping, that is Jiang Zemin, Zhu Rongji, Hu Jintao, and Wen Jiabao, and other Chinese leaders, to bring that transformation and that reform, which allowed the Chinese economy to grow from $1 trillion economy in 1999 to close to about 17 or 18 trillion dollars today. The second point I made was there was a relative relaxation of authoritarian controls. Now, I want to be clear about this because what I don't mean to say is that the dictatorship of the Communist Party in any way diminished. In fact, I would certainly reiterate that China continues to be an authoritarian system, and that there has been no leader of China which has in any way tried to dilute or moderate that system, or to introduce any sort of democratic element as we know it in India or in Nepal. So what do I mean by relative relaxation of authoritarian controls? Essentially, I mean that the Chinese Communist Party demonstrated a lot of flexibility and undertook some experimentation during this time as a means of keeping the party relevant and legitimate. What did they do? The first thing they did was to co-opt new elites, new social groups, the private entrepreneur, the student, the academic, the intellectual. Heretofore, the Communist Party was supposed to be the party of the worker, the peasant, and the soldier. The rest of the so-called bourgeois class was considered to be black hands. But in fact, during the period between 1990 and 2010, they were brought into the political system. And such phrases as class struggle disappeared from the narrative of the Communist Party. The Communist Party became more inclusive. It widened its socio-political base. And this allowed for much greater exchange of ideas within the system by people who had so far been outside that system, including students and including business persons. The second important relative relaxation was that constitutionally, Deng Xiaoping and his successors tried to distance the party not only from the government, but also from business. So you see a lessening of the party's influence, for instance, in business activities. You see greater marketization and privatization of businesses. You see much greater non-state sector activities which were constitutionally protected, and therefore some guarantees were given that they would not be harassed or that there would be no sudden change of policy. Similarly, intellectual discourse on a broad range of subjects was permitted. Of course, so long as you did not question the Communist Party's absolute authority, that was a given. But to a great extent, there was a lot of freedom of expression. And I myself witnessed the difference between my time in China at the end of the 1990s and then when I went back in 2016 and 17. The intellectual freedom that academics, scholars, scientists, business people had in contacting foreigners, in sharing information with them, in talking to them, in exchanging research projects with them, had vanished by 2016 or 17. There were much greater controls again. And finally, of course, there was a relative relaxation in the belief that people had. So you saw a revival of many of the religious traditions, Buddhism, Christianity, even Islam, although of course a tight control was maintained against cults like the Falun Gong. So the main objective of this book was to bring to the average Indian citizen an understanding as to why China showed very spectacular economic growth during this period, and how it fundamentally impacted on its foreign and national security policy. One of the other elements that I did want to share with the Indian public was on how China very cleverly devised its foreign policy, deliberately playing down the antagonism with the West, the ideological problems that it had with capitalism and democracy, in an effort to attract foreign direct investment. And one of the stories I relate is of how China got into the WTO. What is remarkable is not China's ability to negotiate, but China's ability to convince the United States and the West that allowing China entry into the WTO, even though it was not a true market economy, would be beneficial to the West as well. and beneficial not just in economic terms, not just in terms of dollars and cents and profits, but beneficial because they held out the hope that as China economically developed, it might become politically more moderate and even perhaps more democratic. Of course, this has not happened. So in a sense, it was a very clever approach by the Chinese to tailor diplomacy in a way that resonated with the West. And today, when the West expresses concerns about unfair trade practices, about intellectual property right violations, and so on, we should not forget that while the West was also prospering from the Chinese market, such concerns never really came out, although they still existed at that time. And these concerns have surfaced only when Chinese companies are now offering real competition to them. The foreign policy in particular was very adroitly handled because this effort to downplay the Western threat in order to secure Western capital, technology, and human talent, which was encapsulated in Deng Xiaoping's hide the Chinese capabilities and bide our time motto or maxim, was essentially an excellent way of playing the West. And in fact, the title of that chapter is Playing the West. It really allowed the West to believe that by accommodating China, China would allow the Western-led liberal order with the United States directing the global order to continue. And in the meantime, while it played this game with the West, it really built up relations with the Third World. So you see them entering the Third World, providing development assistance, sharing technology, buying resources, and eventually establishing a secure chain from the mine to the port. In other words, if, for instance, they felt that a particular mineral or resource was essential, what we saw in these 20 years was that China would invest in the mine. They would also invest in infrastructure to bring the resource from the mines to the port in that country. They would either have built the port or managed the port. They then built a formidable shipping system, merchant shipping or commercial shipping system, which ensured that these resources were shipped on their ships to Chinese ports. And the idea was to minimize any kind of ability of the West or of anybody they perceived as an adversary to interdict this entire process, which might otherwise impact their economic growth. And this was all done under the noses of the West, under the noses of the United States and Europe. And at the same time, they very quietly built up their ties with Russia. They expanded the footprint in the Third World. They developed relations with the Gulf and so on. The last point I want to make is that along with this very adroit foreign policy was a very determined effort to develop their defense capabilities. And the main focus, of course, was on naval expansion. When President Hu Jintao talked of the Malacca dilemma, the basic objective was already clear by early 2000, which is that China would build a naval force that could challenge the United States in the Indo-Pacific. And so they began building not only the military aspect, but the legal aspect and the historical aspects for territorial claims in various parts of the Indo-Pacific, particularly the East and South China Seas. And I detail this in my book. And therefore, while the world bought their assurances of peaceful rise and of never seeking hegemony and of China never bullying anybody, the Chinese very quietly built up a capability which, at least from my perspective today, is used to bully countries, whether it is by economic means or by military means or by diplomatic means. My last chapter is on what has happened after 2012. And the point I make is that this remarkable growth that China saw in the period between 1990 and 2010 also contained the seeds of subsequent problems that they faced. The first, of course, is massive corruption, a sort of corruption that is much bigger than we have seen in our part of the world. And I would highly recommend a book written by an American professor. Her name, she's a Chinese American, her name is Yuan Ang. Her book, China's Gilded Age, The Paradox of Economic Boom and Vast Corruption, is a book really worth reading to understand the extent of corruption that spread in these 20 years as China modernized and reformed. The second, of course, was a certain political impact it had, because a system of collective responsibility was established, power flowed out of the center to various players in the Politburo, in the Central Committee, and in the provinces. And you also had the problem that the military, the People's Liberation Army, and the internal security institutions, the People's Armed Police and the Public Security Bureau, for instance, became semi-autonomous, almost independent. They went outside the party's control. They were in a position to challenge the party also. You also had the rise of big business and the involvement and interference of business in government policy. And finally, you had almost a vanishing of ideology. Ideology disappeared from the Chinese narrative. It was replaced by a very ultra-nationalistic sort of thinking. But the core ideology of socialism had almost vanished. Almost nobody believed that China was socialist. So the point is that these huge reforms during China's rise also contained the seeds of problems. And it is these problems that began to manifest themselves around the time the global financial crisis took place. Xi Jinping inherited these problems, and he has in one sense tried to address them. But on the other hand, the impact of his measures of reimposition of controls, political controls, economic controls, ideological controls, social controls, have all actually led, I believe, to a constricting or a sort of restrictive impact on China across all fronts, not only in its economy, but also in terms of its international relations, its foreign policy, its creativity in terms of the sciences, the arts, education, and so on. And I have left the readers with the impression that I have, which is that under the current leadership, because of a rollback in the reforms to some degree and because of the reintroduction of ideology, the Chinese are going to face certain consequences across the board. I have, of course, not spelled this out because my intention is to produce the third volume or to write the third volume, which is the period of the current leadership, that is from 2012 until 2022. I'm currently working on that book. And well, I can't, of course, at this stage reach any conclusion because I'm still doing the research. But I do believe there may be some grain of truth to my contention that the restrictive, somewhat the reimposition of controls by the current leader and the current leadership will, in a sense, have an adverse or negative impact on this remarkable phenomenon of China's rise, and in some ways inhibit its rise, and in some ways also complicate not only its economy, but its foreign and national security policy as well. I just want to conclude with a thought, Pramodji, which is that I hope that people in Nepal also read my book. It's written in a very readable way. But the real reason is I hope that it will lead younger people in Nepal to learn more about China proper, rather than simply to read about Nepal-China relations or China-South Asia relations. Because if we don't understand our largest neighbor, both yours and ours, if we don't understand them, what drives them, what are the factors that have led to their rise, what are the reasons holding them back in certain ways, we cannot really, in any sense, deal with this neighbor. And as somebody said, you don't get to choose your neighbor. So geographically, because we are proximate, it is very necessary for us to learn how to deal with that neighbor. We don't have the luxury of geographical separation, and therefore a proper understanding is essential. I will stop there, Pramodji. I'd be very happy to answer any questions that anybody has.
Thank you, Mr. Gokhale. Thank you so much for your remarks. It was really comprehensive and really enlightening. We have received lots of questions, around 70, 75 questions altogether so far, and I'm sure it will be popping up in next 5-10 minutes more. So without taking much time, let me share. It's very difficult to sort out, but I'll take randomly some of them. There are lots of questions, lots and lots of questions, like how do you look at US-China ties? And do you see China as the next superpower? That is what China aspires to. There are lots of questions on, do you see China is going to oversee the US? Where will China stand in next 5 or 10 years? Or when will China oversee, whether China is going to oversee the US militarily or economy? There are lots of questions within this range. So maybe one question would be like, how to look at US-China ties maybe in a coming decade?
Yeah. That's actually a very central issue that both the leaders of China and the United States are also grappling with at the moment. I think we should begin with the historical perspective of how the Chinese Communist Party has looked at the United States. If you look at the writings from the period of Mao Zedong onwards, it has been quite clear to me that China has always looked upon the United States with some degree of concern as a potential threat to its survival and continuance in power. So you have writings by Mao and certain speeches and statements by Deng Xiaoping as well, and these are published in their collected works, where they caution the Communist Party and China's leaders about the intentions of the United States. This is not something which is therefore a new phenomenon under President Xi Jinping. But I believe that under the current leadership, this adversarial streak in the relationship has surfaced. And the Chinese state and the Communist Party now believe that the United States represents an existential threat to it. They also believe that their economic, military, and other capabilities are adequate enough for them to challenge the United States in an effort to gain greater diplomatic and national security space. Now, it is questionable as to whether the Chinese economy will overtake the American economy or whether the Chinese military will overtake the US military. It is not yet clear for two reasons. Firstly, because we still have to study the impact of the last few years on the Chinese economy. And by that, I don't just mean the COVID pandemic. I also mean the impact of President Xi Jinping's economic and national security policies on China's economic growth. China, there is no doubt, is facing some headwinds at the moment. The property market is over-leveraged. Infrastructure investments are not giving returns. Unemployment is at a record high, even though Chinese figures are not willing to admit it. And economic growth is certainly well below the economic growth of the last 20 years. So these are headwinds. On the other hand, China has in the past belied all expectations of economic collapse. It has a leadership which is technocratically capable and experienced, and they have negotiated China's economy out of some difficult situations. The point I'm making is that at this stage, a prediction as to whether China or the United States will be the largest economy and the largest military by 2030 or 2040 is speculative. But what I do want to say is that both for India and for Nepal and for the rest of China's neighbors, this is an academic issue. Because at $18 trillion, the GDP far exceeds that of our GDPs. And that includes Japan, it includes India, it includes ASEAN. These are major economies. So we have to deal with China, which is much stronger. And we also have to deal with a growing US-China polarization, which will have an impact on our economies, on our foreign policy, on our national security, and practically on every other aspect. And I would therefore urge that we should focus not so much on what is happening between the United States and China, as what will be the impact of this rivalry upon us.
Thank you, sir. Let me move to other set of questions. We have lots of questions on India, China, like how rising China is presenting security threats to India or security challenges to India. There are several border standoff between the two countries. So what are the various strategies which India can adopt to meet those challenges? How can India deal with this kind of military competition or military challenges that emerge in the region? There are lots of questions within that. And let me club other component of that in terms, this is security, other is economic. Like in spite of having border tensions and the debacle in the relations, the economy between the two countries is progressing, like in spite of having the standoff, the trade, bilateral trade increase. So how do you look at the economic component and the strategic component between Nepal, India and China relations?
Yeah, okay. Well, you know, we are the two largest countries in the on the Eurasian landmass in terms of population and economy. Russia is probably the largest country in terms of territory, but both its economy and its population is substantially less than India's and certainly much, much smaller than China. And therefore, these are two countries who are interlinked, not only geographically, but in many other ways. And both have mature leaderships which understand both the pitfalls and the opportunities that exist between them. So the first point I want to make is that these are not countries which are governed by individuals who are whimsical. They are governed by individuals who have maturity, who have experience, and who understand that you cannot have major conflict between these two countries without both sides facing consequences. That's the first point. The second point is that in 1988, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi traveled to China precisely with this objective in mind on how to improve the relationship between two of Asia's biggest countries. And there was a certain modus vivendi that was built up between him and the Chinese leadership, which was essentially based on three major, shall I say, pillars. The first was that India would no longer insist that the border problem should be settled before we normalize relations. The second was a commitment on the Chinese part that there will be no use of force or threat of use of force to change the position along the line of actual control or in the border areas until a solution is found. And the third was that each country will respect the space of the other country and both can grow together. Now, for a variety of reasons, and I don't think we have the time to go into them, but my book contains information in this regard, that modus vivendi has broken down. And the main reason I believe is because China's comprehensive national strength has grown to the point where the Chinese leadership has assumed that it can prolong its gap with India indefinitely. In other words, India will never catch up to China. And also on the assumption that there will be no backlash from India if they use certain coercive measures short of actual war, which is what I call gray zone coercion. Now, whether these assumptions are right or wrong is, of course, for the Chinese to decide. But I think that the series of escalating incidents on the line of actual control, which ended with the Galwan River clash, should have made it clear to the Chinese side that perhaps its assumptions might not be accurate. In any case, it is my view that post the Galwan Valley incident, that modus vivendi which was established between Rajiv Gandhi and the Chinese leadership has broken down. Because threat of force and in some cases use of force has actually been the case, and therefore the entire modus vivendi has been called into question. All the border peace and tranquility agreements, all the confidence building measures, and even the assumption that India will set the boundary question aside and get on with the rest of the relationship. Now, of course, what new paradigm emerges is again something which I cannot speak to. Firstly, because I think it is still in the process of evolution. Secondly, because I'm not in government and essentially this is part of government policy. We shall see how this evolves. But to my mind, I would certainly say that one or two things are clear. First, that the Chinese have reintroduced the boundary question in the front and center of this relationship. And I think that if this issue is not in some way addressed, a fully normal relationship is unlikely to take place. Secondly, the economic and trade deficit, the trade deficit is no longer simply an economic issue. A $75 billion trade deficit is very political for India. And I think India has lost patience with the Chinese side, which for the last 20 years has been claiming that they will somehow try to address this issue. They have actually taken no real steps to do so. Therefore, I think there will be some amount of economic impact in the years to come. Now, of course, you could point out and say that trade between India and China is increasing. That is true. But I think in the short term, until alternatives are found, this may not be possible to reverse. But I suspect that in the medium to long term, a certain amount of economic decoupling must take place. Because I think the lesson for us in the pandemic is that dependency on a single source is not good for us. That having been said, I also need to clarify certain notions which exist in China, that India is going to become an ally of the United States or in some way ally with the West. That shows a very sort of poor understanding of Indian diplomacy and of Indian thinking. In fact, if anything, the history of independent India has been one of non-alignment. When we were a weak country economically, when we had just become independent, when we didn't have a strong military, when our diplomacy was undeveloped, even then our leadership chose not to take sides. It is highly unlikely, in my view, that today when India is stronger on all fronts, that our leadership will suddenly decide to ally with somebody against somebody else. And Chinese thinking in this regard is not only naive, but I think their intellectuals and academics do a disservice to their policy makers, because they really have not studied or understood the well springs of Indian diplomacy and of India's national security.
Thank you, sir. Let me move to the next question. Like we all know that China and India are the largest polluter of the world. So how can rising China and rising India join hands in mitigating climate change, which is of global concern?
Yeah, that's a good question. And as I said, there are areas where we have commonality, where we can work together. But we should be clear about two things. Firstly, it is not just China and India's responsibility to mitigate climate change. If the West, which is the historic polluter, does not step up to the plate, India and China are not going to by themselves be able to achieve much. It is also important for the rest of the world to stand together with India and China. Because what the West is effectively saying is that because we have large populations, we must limit our energy consumption, even if that means that we live in relative poverty, so that the West can maintain its development and its level of prosperity. So while they can have their multiple homes, which are air conditioned or heated, and have their yachts on the sea and their multiple numbers of cars, What they are saying is Indians and Chinese should not have a third fan in their house or a second car in their home because your numbers are more than ours and therefore you pollute more. So that's the first point. The second point is India and China are in different situations. China, in fact, is in terms of per capita greenhouse gases far greater than India. India's per capita polluting capacity, let me put it that way, is substantially less than China. So putting the two in the same basket is to some extent unfair to India. Thirdly, I think in our own way, the government has done a lot in trying to mitigate climate change through green energy. Prime Minister Modi has put a great emphasis on solar as well as a substantial emphasis on wind. There is an effort at building up the nuclear power option and the hydro option as well. So I think that is important. Lastly, while there are commonalities on our issues relating to environment, I should nonetheless point out that we have certain concerns so far as China is concerned with regard to the environment in the Himalayan region. And this is something that should be of concern to Nepal as well. Most of the rivers, whether they run through Nepal or through any other part of South Asia, originate on the Tibetan plateau. And there have been recent developments as well as announcements that ought to cause concern to all the lower riparian states about what China intends to do with its water resources in the Tibetan plateau unilaterally and without consultation with the lower riparians. Therefore, as I said, this is not a black or white issue. There are shades of gray. We have common areas with China. There are certain areas which look common, but where there are clear differences. And there are certain areas where we have concerns. And I think we need to work through all these issues. And on some of these issues, as I said, it is not just dependent on India and China. It is dependent on all of us in the region working to mitigate the problem.
So we have received lots of questions on Quad, Indo-Pacific strategy and Russia-Ukraine relations. So we all know that India, US, Japan, and Australia are part of Quad and support US Indo-Pacific strategy, while China is opposed to Indo-Pacific strategy. How do you look at China's engagement with Quad or Quad countries? How do you see the possibility? Do you see the possibility of any major or minor conflict, military conflict in Indo-Pacific region between China and the Quad countries? How do you see the future of Quad or Indo-Pacific post Russia-Ukraine conflict? So maybe one question you would like to address on this.
Yeah, thank you, Pramodji. That's a very good question. Let me first address the difference between the Indo-Pacific outlook and Quad. Let me remind your listeners about the history of India for the past 2,000 years. Where did the prosperity and the wealth of the Indian subcontinent come from? It did not come from the Indo-Gangetic plain. That was where the food was grown. The real wealth and therefore the real prosperity of the subcontinent came from Gujarat. It came from the Kerala coast, the Malabar coast. It came from the Coromandel coast, which is coastal Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh. And it came from Bengal, which is West Bengal and Bangladesh. For centuries, it was India's trade which made enormous amounts of wealth for the people of India. And that is why the British and the Europeans came to India. They didn't come because we were poor. They came because we were fabulously rich. Now, when the British colonial power came, because they wanted to control their trade, they shut India away from its maritime domain. And independent India has regained its interest in that maritime domain. We understand that our prosperity comes from the oceans and the seas, and therefore an Indo-Pacific vision is a natural outcome of that view. I think it is not only naive but unreasonable for the Chinese to suggest that India's Indo-Pacific vision is some kind of an American plan, because it insults India. It suggests that India has no agency of its own, no interests of its own, no history of its own, and that all it does is follow the United States. So I would really urge Chinese scholars to move away from this view and to understand why India has its own Indo-Pacific outlook. So far as Quad is concerned, Pramod ji, this is a platform. It's a multilateral platform where some countries which have a common view or common concerns have come together. Now, is this the only platform that exists in the Indo-Pacific? No, because China has also got a platform. It has recently had a platform between Afghanistan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, and China. It has recently formed one between China, Nepal, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Are we to assume that these are anti-Indian because these are also Quad? Have you ever heard an Indian leader suggesting that these are anti-Indian, that they have been formed against India, even though this is a Quad on our borders? You have never heard that, because in this world where multilateralism is breaking down, plurilateralism is the norm. Whether it is bilateral, trilaterals, quadrilaterals, pentilaterals, or multilaterals, this is the norm. And therefore, it becomes a little difficult for us to show understanding on China's quadrilaterals when it says we can't accept anything India does because it is against us. Now, let me address the last point, which is, are we going to have a conflict with China? I think this is a very naive view which the Chinese academics have been spreading without any basis. If they were to do some research, they would realize that India has no treaty relationships with any of the other three members of the Quad. In other words, we don't have a military alliance with any of the three, right? And therefore, it is unlikely that we are going to involve ourselves in any kind of a military conflict with China. Unless, of course, they aggress against us, which then is an entirely different matter. But I do believe that the Chinese understand this. It is simply that for propaganda purposes, and in order to confuse the rest of the region, they talk of Quad as some kind of a threat and suggest that India has no agency of its own and is simply being fooled into Quad. I think the quicker they come out of this outdated notion, the easier it will be for the region to find a proper security balance so that all of us can get on with economic development, which is really what is required today.
Thank you, sir. We have 3 minutes, but
Yes.
we have more than 100 questions. Let me just try to give you a sense what kind of question exists so that you can choose one of those. You are free to choose. One is that there is like, how do you look at Xi Jinping's third term, how it's going to impact China domestically or the region, because he has secured his third term. Second is like, US has changed its stand on Tibet and Taiwan issues, how it is going to impact the region. There are lots of questions on Tibet and Taiwan issues. There's one interesting question of South Asia. Let me look at it, that all the adversaries of China have the largest trading partner of China. So, however, these adversaries show concerns when small states establish economic ties with China. For example, when China and Nepal has economic ties, China, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, India has concern at times, but at the same time, India and China have a huge economic trade. So how do we react to it? And one last, maybe you can address this or other, like one set of scholars believe that India and China will come together one day, and they always romanticize that 21st century belongs to Asia and we'll have an Asian century. How do you see such possibility or possibility of this idea of Asian century? Over to you, sir.
So I'll very briefly answer a couple of them. I think there is no doubt that this will be an Asian century because the Indian Ocean is returning to its historical place of being the principal water body along which all trade and economic activity takes place, as was the case before 1750. This is the place where the maximum number of resources, energy, and trade flows, and it is going to harbor some of the world's largest economies. And by that, I don't just mean China, India, and ASEAN, but even countries like Bangladesh, like the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and South Africa and Australia. So I have no doubt that it will become an Asian century. But we need to understand what sort of an Asian century will it become. Will it become an Asian century where China is so dominant that the rest of us are merely small players in the region? Or will it become an Asian century where the group of countries which calls itself Indo-Pacific countries, the littoral states of the Indian Ocean, will come together to establish a framework within which we all work and play and live. That is the debate today. And India's Indo-Pacific vision offers a multilateral approach to that region, which is in contrast to China's Belt and Road, which is essentially a hub and spokes system where no prior consultation took place with any country before China announced this. So I believe there will be competing visions of the Indo-Pacific. By itself, that's not a bad thing. It is only when there are competing or multiple visions that will eventually arrive at a consensus. But we don't have any clear understanding of what the Chinese mean by Asian century. And therefore, we need to ask them what they mean. I think India's meaning is quite clear. Anybody who reads the Prime Minister of India's speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue in June 2018 should be clear what India's view of the Asian century is. Let me also touch on this third term of President Xi Jinping. I think a lot has already been written. I don't want to repeat. The fact is that he is in complete political control. He will determine the course of China's economic development and foreign policy. But I see two risks down the road. The first risk I see is a presumption by all of us that because he is politically dominant, there is no internal opposition to him. If we study the history of the Communist Party from 1921 to 2022, there has scarcely been a time when there has been no internal opposition and dissent. And even Mao Zedong, who was such a dominant leader, and I don't believe that Xi Jinping is anywhere close to the influence that Mao exercised over the party, but even Mao faced multiple challenges to his rule. 1955, the Kaokang Raoshusher affair, 1959, the Lushan Plenum and Marshal Pang Dawai, 1966, the Cultural Revolution. There were multiple challenges. There were challenges to Deng. He had to give up two general secretaries who fell, Hu Yaobang and Chao Ziyang. And I have no doubt there are challenges to Xi Jinping within the party. We must bear this in mind. The second point I want to make is that while authoritarian systems look inherently stable, but when they last for a very long period of time, the succession becomes doubtful. So the question is whether President Xi Jinping is there until 2027 or 2032 is not the issue, but time does not wait for anybody. And the question is, will there be a peaceful transition of power thereafter? We must remember that there have only been two peaceful transitions in the entire history of the People's Republic of China, 2002 and 2012. And both were because Deng Xiaoping put certain rules in place which President Xi Jinping has thrown out of the window. Therefore, if the political transition is not peaceful, you could have turmoil. So I would suggest that, scholars need to look at these while, of course, studying the other positive aspects for China's development. Pramodji, I want to thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I really enjoyed the conversation and answering the questions, and I look forward to similar events in the future. Thank you.
Mr. Vijay Gokhale, thank you so much for a very interesting discussion. We really enjoyed and learned a lot. We still have many questions, but as you said, maybe we can have another session in future. I, on behalf of NICE and all audience, would like to thank you for your kind presence and valuable time.
Thank you.
Hope to have you in real, maybe in Kathmandu in future. We'd also like to thank all our audience for their wonderful questions. Thank you and have a nice day.